Welcome to MapCrow, the RPG art show. My name is Kyle, and today we are talking about how to draw trees, ice, and sand. This video is brought to you by the lovely backers of the MapCrow Patreon. For just $5 a month, you can support the show and receive digital minis and terrain for your virtual tabletop gaming. Head on over to patreon.com/mapcrow and pledge today. A while ago, I got a comment asking if I could do a demonstration on how to draw trees, underbrush, glaciers, ice, and sand. And so that's what we are doing today. Special thanks to the viewer Dynestus for suggesting this topic. I am getting an awful lot more comments than I used to in the comments section, but I do my best to keep up on them, especially paying attention to topics that folks are requesting videos on. I want this channel to be as helpful and inspirational for your art making as it can be. What you see me drawing on the screen right now is an ugly tree. You might even think of it as an emoji tree. It's got a completely cylindrical trunk with a big fuzzy blob on the top for where the leaves go. This is sort of the ideal pattern tree. It lives in our imaginations rent-free and has been there probably since we first clutched a crayon. We must do better than this tree. We cannot let this tree that lives in our brain boss us around. The biggest thing that this tree lacks is emphasis. It is a completely balanced and resolved shape, and therefore it is neutral and uninteresting. If you look at the blue lines on this sheet, you can see kind of where this is going. We are going to be making these rows of leaves that are kind of in these concentric rings. And this is going to help give the tree form, contour, and emphasis. Also, we are going to leave the middles of these rings completely blank and only draw our leaves kind of at the left and the right side of these rings of leaf shapes. By making each row of these leaf shapes curve downwards toward the bottom of the page, it gives us the illusion of looking down from above this tree, which is really handy for this isometric perspective. And by handy, I mean essential. I'm also going to bring in a broader tipped marker and start laying in some of the deeper shadows. This is going to increase the sense of emphasis and also volume. Volume is just a fancy word for meaning how 3D a subject appears to be on the page. I feel like I probably overdid it with the shadows on this tree, but I do come back with some whiteout later to correct it. Whether you're working traditionally or digitally, there are always ways to adjust your image after the fact. So don't be nervous. Try to quiet that anxious voice that is telling you not to draw. If drawing makes you happy, don't let yourself talk yourself out of it. When thinking about tree trunks, it's important to go into the woods and stare at trees. You have my permission and indeed my encouragement to go do so. Trees twist around in all sorts of interesting shapes. They are trying to find the light, and especially if a tree grew up around other trees that are a different species, it's going to be kind of twisted in all sorts of gnarly ways. Maybe a storm came by and blew it sideways, so it needed to straighten and correct itself. These kinds of imperfections that you see in nature need to be exaggerated on the page. That's all cartooning really is. It's just exaggerating those realistic details to bring emphasis and nuance to your drawing. Personally, I find it better by far to draw trees without leaves on them when I am making isometric maps. It just reduces the amount of objects that characters and monsters have to hide behind. And on a virtual tabletop, I really don't like to mess with lighting and opacity settings, so I try to make dead trees that take up less of a footprint on the battlefield. Next, we're going to talk about the grass, the shrubs, the dead leaves underneath the tree. Your composition will become completely overwhelmed if you try to draw every blade of grass or every fallen leaf or every shrub or rock. You need to draw only the important ones. The way you know if a clump of grass or a shrub is important is when it is adding emphasis to a transition from one kind of ground to another kind of ground. For instance, I am using all of this grass to draw emphasis and attention to the transition from grass to the road. I am also emphasizing the difference between the grass and the road by juxtaposing these more horizontal marks in the ruts of the wagon wheels going across the road from the generally vertical strokes of the grass next to the road. And when I draw the grass on the other side of the road, I'm not going to shade it as heavily because we've already established with our tree that our light is coming from the top left of the composition. So all I need to do is draw a couple of tufts of grass and then a line connecting it all to emphasize that transition from road back to grass. If I have a large area of grass, I might draw a couple of more tufts in the middle just to break it up, but it would be better probably to draw something that isn't grass in the middle of it to break it up instead. When drawing any kind of rock or crystal or ice, it is important to make sure that we are breaking up this larger shape into smaller shapes that kind of rhyme with it. This big chunk of crystal right here is generally in the shape of a triangle, and all of its kind of subcomponents are also going to be these jagged triangles. And again, we're going to come in with some darker areas of hatching to emphasize which side of this crystal is getting light. And I know what you're saying. Kyle, crystals, ice, these things are bright. They're not dark. Why are you adding so much black to it? It is to give it emphasis and volume. Without it, it's just going to be a big mess of lines. This ties it together and will make this chunk of crystal an element to pay attention to. It will separate it from the rest of the ground. This is really important in isometric maps. If you're going to be drawing snow on top of some ice or some rocks, it becomes important to emphasize that value contrast even more because we want the snow to read as white. So we need to emphasize those shadows and emphasize the differences of the shapes between the sharp icicles, the fluffy snow, and the rocks below it. If you're drawing sand, think about drawing just a couple of sand dunes and then draw a bunch of stuff that's in the desert that isn't sand. The last thing you really need to be spending your time on is drawing every grain of sand. Don't stipple. Don't draw a bunch of dots for where the sand is. Instead, create values by hatching. It'll go by much quicker, it'll be easier on your Micron pen, and your sanity. Stippling here and there to add some texture and tooth is a great idea, but you don't want to shade your sand dunes by just putting Morse code all over the place. But don't forget, there are other things to draw in the desert besides sand, and in fact, that extra context is going to help your sand dunes read more like sand dunes. I've also added some tufts of grass that is waving in the wind, that is indicating that the wind is climbing up the side of the dunes closest to us, which is why we see those ripples there. These ripples are kind of like miniature sand dunes that climb up the windy side of the dune, while the far side of the dune is much smoother. The only other thing that I really want to add is that while this is a fine way to practice specific details, the better form of practice is just to try to fill a whole page and make a whole map. If you spend all of your time practicing little details in isolation, you'll never practice the real puzzle of composition problem solving. All of this emphasis makes a lot more sense when you are putting these things in context of the rest of your art piece. Practicing how to draw trees, practicing how to draw grass, it's all good, but it's all ideally in service of a larger creative goal. And in this case, this goal is to draw a map that other people can use to play RPGs. And if maps are what you want to make, then maps are what you need to finish. And you can improve by critiquing finished work a lot better than you can improve by critiquing tiny little studies in your sketchbook. Of course, this is just my opinion, my observation, and my own art practice. follow your bliss. Do what makes you happy, by all means. I'm not trying to tell you how to be an artist or how to have fun. But I think that just about does it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Next week, we are starting a short series of videos on different topics in world building. I've been thinking a lot about it since talking about it with my students and teaching it as a subject in my narrative imagery class, and my thoughts on this have changed and advanced quite a bit, so I want to revisit the topic. And be sure to check the description below for all of my other projects, places you can buy my maps, listen to my RPG discussion podcast, The Splat Book, subscribe to my newsletter, or check out what's happening on the Patreon. Oh my goodness, I am too busy. In any case, I will see you on the next video, so until then, farewell.